Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, welcome back to the Better Sex Podcast. This is Jessa, and I am so thankful that you're here, spending your time with me. I appreciate it. I strive to bring you useful, maybe inspiring information every week. I know the podcast covers a huge range of topics. They're kind of all over the board, and not all of them are going to be relevant to you, at least not today, but I hope at least you find them interesting. Today's topic is maybe more for people that identify as women. The idea is that we get messages about what to expect in our relationships, in our sex life, that are sort of like a fairy tale. You know, we're not really told how hard it is to keep sex and passion and intimacy alive over time, how hard it is to balance and juggle grown-up life with career and relationship and children. You know, and if we're not prepared for those struggles, we can think we're failing. My guest today is Kara Haug. She is a sexual health educator and counselor. She runs a business called Grace Unbound. And she works with families, she goes to schools, retreat centers, churches, large events, and she leads workshops and speaks. And she has a real passion for augmenting, facilitating conversation about sex, sexuality, intimacy, and relationships among people so that they can have much greater happiness and fulfillment. And today she's going to be talking about the fairytale expectations that we are set up to have often, and the communication we need to have with our partners and others to navigate those challenges. I hope you enjoy it. Kara, thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm glad to have you. So we're talking a little bit about the stories and sort of gender roles that people might be, I guess I'd say, saddled with.
Right.
What do you think the biggest misconception is that women have, you know, that we've been taught about sex and sexuality?
Well, I think some of the biggest misconceptions that women have is, you know, I want to say that we've been, since we were young, you know, like 2 or 3, been given the ideal of the fairy tale where, you know, like the romance of sexuality and how things are supposed to be. I would say, like, in terms of the relationship and in terms of the partnership and stuff, that it has to be, you know, like a big deal. Like we are fed the romance story, right? Like we feel like when we're first engaged with one another, we have that Twitter-pated feeling and there's the romance, and we think like that is going to be carried on throughout the whole thing. And when it dwindles, I think we're kind of like, wait a minute, why are we not feeling this? Where we don't recognize that there's kind of an expiration date on that with our chemicals and, you know, the hormones in our brain and stuff. And so I feel like we've just been fed all of this fairy tale scenario of what it looks like. And then when we enter into the relationships and realize that they're work, we're like, oh, and that the fact, like, also that our arousal and desire doesn't work as we think it should, you know, that a lot of our brain is involved and that we need more time and we need to have more communication and different things like that. So I feel like there's a lot playing in, and I feel like, I mean, with men and women, like we have these ideas that were given to us in childhood that we take with us and that aren't necessarily true in how things really function in terms of sexual relationships, you know, within long-term partnerships.
It sounds like the theme here is we are fed a story that this is all going to be easy.
Yeah, I want
right?
to say, yeah. I think that is true. And I feel like, so many women who I've talked to, like who are in their 30s right now, who are moms and married, are exhausted and they sit down and they say things like, I feel like I've been bamboozled a little bit, and I think it's just because, I remember in college when girls would like enter into these dorm rooms and we couldn't wait to sit down and watch the baby story and the wedding story and watching what it was like to have, I think what we were given as the goal, right? To have the long-term partnership and then to become mothers and stuff. And it was like we were sitting there drooling, looking at this, lifestyle that makes you feel like, oh, you've arrived. I feel like that's kind of a script we've been given. Like, this makes you feel like you've arrived and here you are. And so it's like we've dreamt of what it means to have this wedding and being, it's like we make people the princess for the day. And then, but there's never what happens after? What happens after this ceremony that people participate in, Yeah.
So I'm hearing, I'm hearing a few different things. So one, we've got like literally the fairy tale thing, right? Happily ever after, as if there's never any work or challenge or anything else.
Yeah.
But then I guess you're also saying even the goals we might aspire to, right? Like this is what we're supposed to have is a wedding perhaps, or children, or that there's a desired outcome.
Yeah. And I feel what I feel that today in terms of, the families I work with and the women who come and speak with me is that we were raised in this time period where it was like, you can have everything. Go for your career, find what you love to do, make your dreams happen. And by the way, you should also be partnered and have children. And you can do all those things without anything giving, right? Without sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I think that is the thing that people are struggling with, where it's like, clearly, yes, you can be working and have kids and all this too. But I think it's one of those things where, you enter and you're like, oh, I didn't know this was going to be so hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So again, nobody prepares us for how difficult some of this is going to be, whether it's our relationship, and interactions with our partner, or our sex life, or combining, parenting and working, whatever else it is. Like real life is much more complicated and difficult than people tell us ahead of time.
Right. Yeah. I feel like we don't have those conversations of preparation for people ahead of time, like enough education around understanding the role that, once you have children, what happens, how your sexual relationship and intimacy changes. We are not having enough conversations around the fact that, we get married just utterly in love, or like have commitment ceremonies of utterly in love, and how things also change, and that how you move into attachment and what does that mean? And then, how do you keep the passion alive that you had in the beginning and moving forward, and how things change,
All right, but I'm also thinking about the kinds of messages that women may get specifically about their sexuality, and sort of cut off from the power of it, or feeling ashamed of it, or, the sort of Madonna whore dynamic, or, binary that people can get into. Like there's a lot of messages just about sex and sexuality that we get too.
Yes. So it's unfortunate because I do believe that still to this day, women feel like they don't have the power around their sexuality. They're starting to come to realize that they do, but it's like, it's almost as though we can't claim our own desire and our own sexual yearnings, that we have. And I also feel like, when I speak with youth today, I always ask them, so tell me what messages you're getting of what it means to be a girl or a woman, and I talk about even in terms of binary, because people are still processing that way. So I'm like, tell me the messages. And they say still that if you explore your sexuality, or like if you start engaging physically, then you're a slut. So there's still this whole thing of, if are interested and are, kissing or being intimate with a person, then you're automatically a slut. And then there's that whole part of, you have to be virtuous, like there's still that dichotomy that's still happening, or duality that's still happening, which makes me so sad and frustrated, because it's still like we have to constantly, I think, navigate and work around of like, how do I be a sexual creature in this world? And then it's like you become a parent, right? So then it's like, then you get into this romantic relationship where all of a sudden it's okay now, especially if there's still to this day the marriage involved, then you're supposed to be almost like this vixen, of like, now let it come out.
Right. When you get married.
Right.
Or partnered anyway. Yeah.
Right. And then you become a mother, and then now your body is also being used as a feeding source, and it has changed. And you're like, well, what is this? And how do I work? How am I a mom? And how can I also be this sexual being? Because you still have fantasies and you still want to live out your own sexual play or desires that you have, but you're also like, how do I do this? Being a mom.
It's kind of a dramatic role shift, right? If we're mom all day and then we want to be lover at night, right? Like, yes, it can be a challenge for people.
Yes. Yeah. And I think too, like, people are also, you become a mom and you become exhausted and you're like, well, what does this even mean? How do I make this happen? My body has been touched all day long. Like you said, I don't know how to be intimate again. And so there's this, but then there's also this thing of, well, you're a mom and you shouldn't almost even partake in some of your desires, but then you're also a wife and so you should.
Right.
So there's some of those things happening as well.
Right. So what do you think the biggest threat to marriages is? I mean, is it these messages that we're all getting that it's easy or should be easy?
Yeah, I think it's that. I think because it should be easy and things should just happen once you are partnership, like you should be able to just have sex in an easy way. But I also think it's because we lose ourselves. I think there's an aspect that we forget. Our society right now is so busy in terms of, I mean, all of us have these dreams and aspirations and we want to like work towards those, but also our economy makes it, I think, really hard for those working families in terms of like trying to make the money. For some reason, parenting right now, you feel like you have to do everything. You have to entertain the kids. You have to make sure that they're involved with as many things as they constantly can be involved with, so that they are able, I think, to have a good future, right? Because it's not like where it used to be where there's that expectation that you do better than your parents. Like now we are in this part where we're not doing as well as our parents, just because of economy and loans and different things like that. So there's that extra pressure of finance, and then, daycare being very expensive and different roles that we are taking on. And so I think people get trapped into becoming almost like business partners or roommates. And a lot of times our identity gets lost in that. And so I feel like that is where people are struggling in their marriages, is that they're just actually trying to get through the day. They're trying to just pay the bills and keep things moving and feeling like they have to be, super parents. And so my thing is, I want people to be able to recognize that it's really hard, that we have to learn how to have conversations continually, and that we have to learn how to make ourselves a priority and not let our identities get lost in the mix, and remember why we fell in love, right? And why we're together, and making weekly date nights and different things like that, even if it's just in your home, of just sitting down and connecting, because it's really hard. And I hear so many couples talking about that, like they just almost like can't get it together, right? Because like, how do you do this when we have so many other outside expectations we have to meet?
Right. I mean, so much of this ties to the idea of, how do we continue to prioritize our couple relationship?
Right.
Our intimate, sexual, romantic partner relationship, not just as co-parents or co-managers of the household or employees or,
right.
Put effort and attention and investment into that relationship all along. Instead of looking up 10 years from now and thinking, oh, shoot. What happened?
Yeah, we should have done that. Yeah. And that's like almost what I'm hoping, and what I would want to bring to our community is to be able to have, starting people out in like everyone goes through these childbirth classes before they have children, but to have a component of that's like of relationship conversations of like, okay, now let's talk about what it would look like when you do have kids and bringing them into your world. What is your expectation of sex? What do you think that's going to look like? What kind of ideals and needs do you need in your relationship? And a lot of times people don't know that, but just being able to spark that conversation of talking about in the very beginning what our needs and wants are and what does that look like, and being able to process through those things together and recognizing like, hey, like we need to do this like once a week, or like once a month, and talk about how are we sexually and what do we need, and realizing that it doesn't always have to be intercourse, but just being able to like touch each other and do like a massage or being, intimate in those ways, and exploring different ways if we're too tired, to, have intercourse or whatever, so.
Right. Like, the Gottman Institute offers that, Bringing Baby Home course, which I think is geared for exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know, from my own experience, but also working with clients, is we can't anticipate what those challenges are going to be or how they're going to feel to us.
Right.
Like even with all that advanced conversation, if you have it,
right,
it's not like we can preemptively deal with or strategize about exactly how it's going to be once we get there. It's so challenging.
It is. And I tell people too, like, alongside of that is like, we always think about what it was going to be like I had talked about, but also like, you never know kind of what parent you're going to be until you become a parent.
Right.
And,
right.
Because then you're like, oh, hey, even from like your past, like, oh, I thought I was over that. But then you have all these other emotions that come up that you don't even realize were there. And so I think really what people need to work on is being comfortable having these conversations
right
continually. And I think that's where we're uncomfortable because we haven't been taught really how to have these conversations or how to be as vulnerable with one another around this stuff. And I think that's where the issue is learning how to talk, I want to say.
Hey, it's Jessa here, just taking a quick break in the show. So glad you're with me today. I want to invite you to be a part of the conversation. I run a free Facebook group called Sex, Intimacy, and Relationships. And I share articles and resources. I foster conversation and community. I'm there to answer questions if you post them. And I broadcast live, delivering information, ideas, inspiration that could help you with your sex life. I'd love to have you join me there. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/community.
So you've been through some of this, right? Like a journey in your own relationship into being a mother?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So what was the hardest part for you, once you entered motherhood in terms of your sexuality and your sexual relationship?
Yeah. The hardest part for me was, I think, the fact, like, one thing that and this is personal, but I didn't realize that I could experience some past trauma that I had experienced would come up through my interaction with my child. So, in terms of like breastfeeding, for instance, I had a really difficult time breastfeeding. And for me, that was something that I was looking forward to a lot, but my child wasn't able to latch. And I had trauma back a while ago around my breasts. And I didn't realize that I could experience trauma from my baby trying to breastfeed.
Wow.
And I think there is actually quite a few women who do experience something around their bodies when they become mothers that has been unlocked, if I can say.
Yeah. Or
unleashed. And that's something that I feel also isn't talked about as much. And it's not to say like you don't even, you can't, like you said, like expect that or like be able to know what to do in the process. But understanding later, like once I've gone through and became a sex educator and realized what that was, I was like, oh, like I could give myself more grace. But I put a lot of like guilt and shame upon myself of not being able to breastfeed, and knowing that when I was trying to breastfeed that I was crying all the time. And so that became kind of like a place where I wasn't able to be nearly as close to my husband as I could because I had some of my own stuff. But I think too, just, you know, being exhausted and feeling isolated. For me, when I first became a mom, you know, I was at first in a grad school kind of setting and people were helpful there. And my husband and I moved away and we're in the process of getting these new jobs. And it just became very isolating. And for me, it was like the sense of identity of not knowing who I was as much anymore. And so I would say like the best thing later, I mean, I moved a lot. And so part of it was the not having like a community. But I have met this woman out here where I live now in California, and she did a wonderful thing where she has created this group even with on Facebook where just mothers who she has met, she's a doula, and she has just connected moms and have put them into this community, and she names it the Village. And so it was a place where everyone could come and just like, not all of us know each other, but we just like reach out to one another and say, you know, I'm going through this. Has anyone experienced this? And people talk about sex on there too. Like, how are you with intimacy with your husbands? We're getting stuck in this. Or I don't know what to do about my child in this. And so there's just like this camaraderie of like, and support system of being able to open these doors of having a conversation. And I think that's so important for people to understand. Yeah.
Right. So we're talking about the importance of being able to talk to your partner, right? Ongoing about the challenges and what's going on and what to do. But also, you know, you're talking about the importance of talking to other women, other mothers, other, you know, other people.
Yeah.
In terms of getting support.
Yeah. I think we just have to kind of break down these walls of feeling. I feel like there's this need to always put up face, you know, of like, oh, I'm okay. We're fine. Look how good we are. But everyone, I think, is having a hard time in their own way. And I think that's okay because we're on a learning curve, right? Like this is like you're learning about becoming a parent. You're learning about how to maintain intimacy in a marriage or in a partnership. And that's okay. And being able to say, hey, like, what do you guys do? Or do you have any ideas is perfectly fine. And I guess I just see so many, you know, some of the women I'm talking about just feel so sad and just feel like there's something wrong with them. And I think that we just need to get across like, no, there's nothing wrong with you. Like, this is hard. You know, it's not something that, you know, is widely discussed. And so I just want people to know, like, they're seen and they heard, and there's, you know, we have support, like people can support one another. And I think that's what we need to do in these circumstances.
Well, it dovetails with what you led off with this whole fairy tale story we were sold. You know, the tendency is frequently to think something's wrong with me if it doesn't look like that.
Exactly.
I must be failing in my relationship, or somehow this is really bad, you know, which would prevent people from sharing.
Right. Exactly.
So what do you hear women saying the most about sexuality in the course of their lifetime? I mean, as their mothers, but also as their relationships just sort of mature and move through time.
I think they want, I mean, a lot of them are still kind of trying to figure out really their sexuality and what gives them pleasure, of being able to have permission to explore that, and being able to navigate that as being a mom, and just wanting to feel that sense of being desirable and stuff again. Like, there's a lot of women struggling with body image. Of course, it's like an ongoing thing in our society.
Right.
But being able to feel sexy, being able to feel desired, and wanting, I think, that permission to explore their sexuality, because I do think there's many people now who, you know, with our education, we're not as within America, like we're not taught as much that we can have ownership, right, of our sexuality and our desires. And I think like once they get into these committed partnerships, then they're like, oh, wait a minute, I can have pleasure. I deserve pleasure. What does that look like? How can I ask for that? And how can I make space for it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do about these messages we've gotten, the stories and narratives that we've been raised with? I mean, on the one hand, I'm thinking, okay, what do we start teaching our kids and youth today? Like what should be the messages that young people, especially young women, should get, do you think?
You know, I have a daughter, so I'm just starting with her. I say things. She's very much totally into this fairy tale thing too. Like I've recognized like she's taken on some of her own ideals of romance from those. And I say flat, like point blank to her, like, you know, that's not all that there is. This isn't, you don't need, because part of it is saying in these fairy tales, you need a man to save you. Right?
Yeah. Right.
And so I tell her, I'm like, you can be your own person. You can be yourself. You don't need someone to save you. It's nice to have a partner, but you don't always need that. So I try to like give messages like that. I think it's important for us to talk to the youth about what intimacy is, what it means to have conversations, hard conversations, and what is attachment. Because we're really good at the romance and we're really good at falling in love. But I don't think we're good at having those conversations of what does it mean then to journey together? And what does it mean to work through hard things? And what does that look like?
Yeah.
You know, when I'm a sex educator, and so when I talk about consent, you know, a lot of the times when I talk to girls and women, they say things like, I didn't even know I was able to say no. And then there's this sense of, we talk about, you have to give the yes and you can say the no. But my thing is, how do you do that? Like, we're not giving the language around that. And so we have to be able to help kids have language. And I think there's many adults who don't have that language. Right. So being able to guide in conversations and providing as many opportunities to have conversations about this stuff as we possibly can.
It also seems to me it's important to model this for our kids in terms of, I mean, not that you want to have all your disagreements with your partner in front of them or, you know, fight in front of them or anything else, but some idea that they understand there's work in a relationship and they're watching you do that, or you're talking about, you know, we have challenges, but we're working together, and they see repair, and they, you know, that this isn't all happening behind closed doors.
Yeah. You know, that happens with my, you know, husband and I. If we have like a disagreement, my kids would be like, stop fighting. And we look at them, we're like, oh, we're not fighting. We're just trying to work this out. We're trying to talk about it.
Yeah.
You know, because we're disagreeing. And so we're trying to get to a point where we can come to the center, you know, or figure out how we meet in the middle. I'm like, we're not fighting. So yeah, being able to have those hard conversations. And I think too, I mean, realistically, I think something that we're going to see, and I work with youth a lot, is conversations are very different now that we have text and that we have these devices that we hold every day in our hands, our phones. We are getting away from being able to learn how to have those hard conversations and how to experience eye contact and needing that intimacy. And so I think that we have more of instant gratification or things where we can shut down more easily than in the past. That is why I think it's so crucial to model in your home different ways to be intimate, whether playing games together, whether sitting on the couch and cuddling, and finding ways to have conversations where we have devices not in front of us.
Yeah. There's just so many levels on which we model what it means to be in a relationship, you know, and what intimacy and connection look like.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've done different exercises with youth where I have had them, you know, look into each other's eyes, like we did a staring contest kind of thing. And I said to them, you know, whoever can look at each other longest without laughing, like laughing in the beginning is fine, but who can sustain that? And what's fascinating is those who have, you know, won the contest, I've asked them, I'm like, so tell me about how you were able to do that. And they had said, one of them said, I pretended they weren't there.
Oh, wow.
And then the other one said, I pretended they didn't exist, or I pretended that I was mad at them. And I had said to them, well, that's interesting. How come you couldn't recognize them? How come you couldn't just see who they were and make space for them? And they said, because that's weird. And I said, but do you realize to have an intimate relationship, you have to have eye contact, and you have to hold space for a person, and you have to learn how to be vulnerable, And so if we are having youth who think it's weird to just look at each other, then how are we going to have these conversations, right? To help hold space for the other and how they're feeling, and to have to have a better sex life and intimacy, So.
Well, of course, it's making me think of, plenty of clients that I've worked with that don't make eye contact in sex or intimacy. I don't think it's just the youth that struggle with that.
Right.
Or it's just devices. I think that we've not necessarily been raised to have experiences where we can be totally present and be seen and see the other. And,
Yeah. So I think this is where the learning, where we have a lot of learning to do for, again, for adults and kids, like you were saying.
Yeah.
I know I even struggle in my own personal relationship, and I'm an educator, but it's just being able to let our guards down. And that's what we have to keep working on.
Right. And it's like so much of this work, I feel like it's a lifelong process. It's not something we should have mastered by the time we're 30.
Right. Yeah. And I think, and that's where I feel like we have to give each other grace, right? Because there's so many of us who thinks well, I should have this figured out now, right? I'm this age. Why don't I have it figured out? And it's well, there's many factors, but you're learning, and that's okay. And let's just keep going and doing this together and keep learning.
Right.
So
where can people learn more about you?
Oh, yeah. So I have a website called Grace Unbound. And that's, I don't have an Instagram or Facebook yet. That's what I'm working on. So Grace Unbound, that's my business. And I do a lot of workshops, and I go and talk in schools. And my passion, too, is helping families learn how to navigate conversations around relationships and youth, and helping them learn about how to talk about sexuality with making it just a normal day-to-day conversation. And so I work a lot with families around that.
Great. I will put the link in the show notes too, so people can find you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.